Mutants. For decades, they were the jewel in the crown of Marvel Comics. The highest selling single issue of all time, one of the most critically acclaimed superhero cartoons ever made, and a multi-billion-dollar film franchise. But the world moved on. Humanity evolved. As other superpowered teams took centre stage, the divide between Homo sapiens and Homo superior grew larger. But from the ashes of this once great franchise, the Phoenix rises. And now, before their grand introduction to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the X-Men wait in the wings for their second genesis. I love the Fox-produced X-Men movies, I really do. The original trilogy was a big deal to me growing up, and while I didn't care much for the later McAvoy and Fassbender films, the franchise showed brief bursts of brilliance all the way through to the end. They say it's better to burn out than fade away, but with this year's Dark Phoenix failing to strike a chord with audiences, almost 2 decades of marvellous mutant movies just kind of fizzled out. Bummer. Today, I want to pay tribute to those early X-Men films that meant so much to me as a dorky, comic book reading kid who always felt kind of different. Let this be my love letter to those halcyon days of black leather jumpsuits, bad wigs, and wraparound sunglasses. Oh, and terrible movie tie-in games. So, load up the Blackbird jet and set course for memory lane. I'm Josh from Panels to Pixels, and this is every X-Men movie game ranked and reviewed. X-Men The Last Stand, the third installment in the movie franchise, caught a lot of flack from fans and critics when it first released. More than it deserved, if you ask me. Bloated plot and mishandling of the Dark Phoenix saga aside, it packs plenty of iconic mutant moments and blessed us with one of the best casting decisions in the history of comic book movies. That's right, Kelsey f***ing Grammer as Beast.
Hey baby, I hear the blues are calling.
Released in 2006 to coincide with The Last Stand, X-Men The Official Game is an action beat-em-up title for the GameCube, PlayStation 2, Xbox, and Xbox 360. A quick disclaimer before we go any further, I'm only going to be talking about the console versions of all of these games, although every title on this list had a handheld equivalent. What's cool about this game is that it's actually set in between the second and third films, covering some of the events that happen off-screen. I love when movie tie-in games aren't afraid to go outside the lines and actually expand on a film's universe. And in this case, the game actually provides context for some of the stuff in the movie, such as why Nightcrawler was mysteriously absent. In the game, you take control of either Wolverine, Iceman, or Nightcrawler for a series of levels which put each character's mutant abilities to the test. In keeping with the way the character is handled in the movies, Cyclops is off doing something else, because, oh hey look, it's Wolverine! As Wolvie, you will claw your way through various fighting stages against endless waves of armed bad guys. Imagine the most weightless, generic video game combat you can think of, and you'll have a pretty good idea of how these Wolverine stages play out. It's very basic and very clunky. They did at least get his healing factor right, although in order to activate it you have to stand in one spot and listen to Logan's weirdly sexual heavy breathing. For the Iceman stages, you take control of Bobby Drake on his trusty ice slide as you complete time challenges and fly through rings. Hey wait a minute, this is just Superman 64. There are some cool sections such as this one where you have to navigate your way through the winding coolant tunnels of a nuclear reactor, but for the majority of these stages it's just flying around empty maps and firing off the occasional ice beam. But the real highlight of the game is the Nightcrawler stages, which have you bamfing around from platform to platform. You can combine Kurt Wagner's teleportation ability with his fighting prowess to create some really satisfying combat. Unlike virtually everything else in this game, the Nightcrawler gameplay is actually a lot of fun and it never gets old. At various points throughout the story, you can call on other X-Men such as Storm or Colossus for support. But for the most part, it's either Weapon Untitled Avatar sequel, or Frosty this blows man. You see, one of the game's biggest problems is that the levels are way too short. In fact, I hesitate to call them levels at all. They're more like mini bonus stages to a more fully developed game that doesn't exist. And it's all just so damn repetitive. It's almost as if Z-Axis, the game's developers, designed one basic level for each of the 3 characters, and then just copied and pasted them until they had the approximate length of a full retail game. Several actors from the films reprised their roles, including Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, Patrick Stewart as Professor X, Alan Cumming as Nightcrawler, and Shawn Ashmore as Iceman. This at least shows that some care was taken and money spent, and to be fair, not one of the actors can be accused of phoning it in. As I mentioned earlier, the story takes place after the events of X2 and leads right up to the beginning of X-Men The Last Stand. Written by legendary X-Men scribe Chris Claremont and The Last Stand screenwriter Zach Penn, the game's campaign takes you through various iconic X-Men locations and has you going up against the likes of Sabretooth, Magneto, and Lady Deathstrike. Sidebar, is anyone else seriously grossed out by Lady Deathstrike and her gross long fingernails? Ugh. It's called a manicure, honey. Go and get one. Anyway, it's a short but engaging story that introduces many elements from the comics never before seen in the X-Men films. You get the first canonical appearance of Sentinels, an introduction to the Silver Samurai, and even Hydra. Yes, that Hydra. This was a pre-MCU world, don't forget. The plot is told to us through these static painted cutscenes. I found them a bit jarring at first, but I soon came to appreciate this comic book style of storytelling. I imagine these were included because it was cheaper than having CG cutscenes, and in hindsight, these digitally painted renders have probably aged a lot better than a 3D model of Halle Berry from 2006 would have. Still, some of the likenesses definitely look better than others. For example, I love how Wolverine is frequently depicted as having no neck. What superhero game is complete without hundreds of collectible items and unlockable suits? Here though, the various pieces of Sentinel tech and Weapon X files are just arbitrarily scattered across each tiny level in plain sight. It comes across as an afterthought and can get very tedious to pick them all up. There's also an upgradable skill tree, but honestly, who cares? It all just feels so inconsequential in a game with such repetitive gameplay. It all adds up to a decidedly cheap superhero experience. Even playing on the Xbox 360, and despite the game's box boasting next-gen HD graphics, this looks and feels like a PS2 or original Xbox game. It was a nice idea to combine the three diverse playstyles of some of the most famous members of the X-Men, but it's a real mixed bag in terms of quality. There's really nothing here that hasn't been done better in other games starring Marvel's team of Merry Mutants. And speaking of other games, X-Men Mutant Academy. I've talked about this title many times on the channel before, and how, as a kid, I always gravitated more towards this series than the Marvel vs. Capcom games. I mean, why wouldn't I want to play a fully 3D fighting game starring my favourite superhero team? This game was obviously superior to the 2D Marvel vs. series. I mean, it had a whole extra D. Alright, so maybe I backed the wrong horse in that respect, and I'm not here to argue that Mutant Academy is the superior fighting title. But looking back, I've come to appreciate all of the little things that this game does so well, and why I keep on going back to it. 2000's X-Men Mutant Academy is a fighting game developed by Paradox Development for the PlayStation and released to tie into the first X-Men movie. Go up against your fellow mutants and battle your way to a final face-off with the man known as Magneto. I know this one is kind of a stretch on this list of X-Men movie games, but it is technically a tie-in title, packed full of unlockable content from the film. You can even unlock alternative costumes from and inspired by the movie, for the ultimate early 2000s leather biker suit experience. There is no story mode or anything like that to speak of, but really, who buys a fighting game for the story? In fact, what I really love about this game is its simplicity. You've got an arcade mode, a 2-player versus mode, a survival mode in which you see how many rounds you can get through on a single health bar, and a training mode which is cleverly presented as a danger room session guided by Professor X himself. Nothing is wasted in this title, which allowed Paradox Development to cram the game full of unlockable content. From CG cutscenes to heavily compressed comic book panels and movie stills. And let's not forget this trailer for the first X-Men movie in glorious 240p. Gameplay wise, it's exactly what you'd expect from a fighting title. Light, medium and heavy punches and kicks mapped across the face and shoulder buttons. There are also special moves which are super easy and satisfying to pull off, as well as dedicated counter and throw buttons which add a surprising amount of variety to the moves list. When it comes to the roster of playable characters, all the A-listers are present and accounted for. From heroes such as Cyclops, Wolverine, Jean Grey and Storm, to members of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants like Magneto, Mystique, Sabretooth and Toad. This lineup is clearly influenced by the movie, but you also get a couple of fan favourites from the comics and animated series with the inclusion of Gambit and Beast. All of the playable fighters are fairly well balanced with a diverse set of moves to suit all playstyles. For example, Beast worked out really great for me as a button bashing noob. His increased strength is perfect for brute forcing your way through bouts, and I had the most success when playing as him. But if you prefer to keep your distance and play defensively, the likes of Cyclops, Jean Grey and Gambit all have ranged attacks that can be particularly devastating without getting too up close and personal. I have a lot of really fond memories of this game from when it first came out. Seeing 3D models of my favourite mutant superheroes was pretty mind-blowing back in the day, although I have to admit some of this hasn't aged so well. The CG intro and unlockable cutscenes are particularly nightmarish, with Professor X looking like James McAvoy wearing Patrick Stewart's face over his face.
Your training has shown you to be undisciplined, unconventional, insolent, and an X-Man.
That being said, the actual in-game models hold up fairly well, and the various stages accurately depict locations from the comics, from the Savage Land to Genosha. Overall, the game was relatively well received by fans and critics, and was followed by 2 sequels, X-Men Mutant Academy 2 and X-Men Next Dimension. So, it's a respectable X-Men title. But how well does Mutant Academy stack up against other fighting games from the time? Well, it's not as accessible as something like Tekken 3, and clearly it doesn't have the same production value when it comes to character models and fully 3D stages. Meanwhile, it lacks the super fast cartoony action of the Street Fighter and Marvel vs. Capcom series. Still, as a snapshot of mutant mania at the dawn of the millennium, there is just something so enchanting about this game. And while it's not a true X-Men movie title, it's one that holds a special place in my heart.
It comes back to me in the blink of an eye. Bits and pieces. Like the dream you start to forget as soon as you wake up. Or maybe more like a nightmare.
Next up, we have 2003's X2 Wolverine's Revenge, a third-person action game released for the GameCube, PlayStation 2 and Xbox to coincide with the release of the second X-Men movie. Just looking at this game, it should be immediately apparent that more care went into this title than in X-Men the official game, or in fact most movie tie-in games. But wait a minute, that doesn't look anything like Hugh Jackman. He's not even wearing the right suit. That's because, despite the movie-inspired title and Jackman himself gracing the game's box art, X2 Wolverine's Revenge really has nothing to do with the X-Men film franchise. It's a wholly original story inspired by the comics, even down to the fact that this version of Logan is clearly ripped straight from the pages of Grant Morrison's new X-Men series. The story, written by 90s Wolverine comic scribe Larry Hama, is actually very compelling and forced me to look past the slightly dated gameplay and clunky controls. Meanwhile, I think the more stylized comic book look of the game, and particularly of Wolverine himself, does the game a huge favour, and the visuals have aged a lot better than most movie games from the time that attempted to use actor likenesses. Nowadays, Wolverine's Revenge is most fondly remembered for the fact that the title character is voiced by Mark Hamill. Of course, Hamill is no stranger to the world of superhero games, having lent his iconic Joker voice to the Arkham series. Here, the Star Wars actor offers a very different take on everyone's favourite Canadian mutant, who isn't Deadpool. To me, this feels very much like Chris Claremont and Frank Miller's Wolverine from the 1982 4-issue miniseries, monologuing like a grizzled old detective in a noir thriller. At times though, his voice is just a bit too slick and polished for my taste. It lacks the gruff, untamed nature of iconic Wolverine voice actors like Cal Dodd, Steve Blum, or even Hugh Jackman. But it's a great performance nonetheless, and in a way, Hamill's more subdued and contemplative take on the character is perfectly matched to the slower, more meditative gameplay. Because, for a character mostly associated with claws-out action and fits of berserker rage, this game goes out of its way to slow Logan down with frequent and lengthy mandatory stealth sections. At this point, it seems a bit reductive to compare every single superhero game to the Batman Arkham series, particularly a game which predates Arkham Asylum by a good 5 years. But in many ways, the stealth system in X2 Wolverine's Revenge is the progenitor of the Dark Knight's trademark combo of detective mode and silent takedowns. Holding down the L trigger activates Wolvie's heightened senses, highlighting enemies and environmental hazards such as lasers or explosive mines. It also allows you to sneak up on the bad guys and perform some pretty gnarly stealth strikes. But when the shit hits the fan, Wolverine is still the best there is at what he does. And as it turns out, what he does is slowly and awkwardly punch people in the face. The combat in this title is pretty much what you would expect in a 3D brawler from this era, with punch and kick attacks that can be combined to form basic combos. They're really not the most responsive controls in the world, and I often found myself furiously mashing buttons with little success. It's a combat system that rewards playing defensively, blocking often and looking for opportunities to strike your opponents. Again, this isn't exactly the kind of balls to the wall action we've come to associate with the character, but it's really not awful once you get the hang of it. What is awful though is the automatic enemy lock-on that only allows you to take on one opponent at a time. Go up against a gang of more than, say, 5 bad dudes, which, spoiler alert, you'll do a lot, and be prepared to get wailed on from every direction. And then there are the checkpoints, or lack thereof. This game can be brutal at times, with long 15 to 20 minute stages with nary a checkpoint in sight. The sheer difficulty of Wolverine's Revenge actually reminded me more of something like an NES game. Because of this, I found myself getting very frustrated when I first started playing, but I soon discovered that patience is a virtue. Once I started to approach each level with the understanding that I probably wouldn't beat it on the first attempt, I found myself having a lot more fun. The stages that rely heavily on stealth can be particularly grueling. Back in 2003, stealth games were still relatively novel. The Metal Gear Solid series had refined and redefined its own unique brand of covert crouching, sure, but for the most part, the art of sneaking around had yet to be perfected. In X2 Wolverine's Revenge, getting spotted even once often means instant mission failure, and as such, approaching each new stage becomes a process of trial and error. Memorizing routes and enemy patterns is the key to success, and you have to accept that replaying the same section over and over and over again is part of that learning process. There is far less room for improvising than in something like the Arkham games, so each level becomes a kind of puzzle. So, does it suck when you fail that same long-ass stealth mission a dozen times? Oh yeah. But is it incredibly rewarding when you finally figure it out and all the pieces come together? Yeah, it really is. All in all, there's a hell of a lot to like about this game, from the stylish presentation to its adherence to the comics and Mark Hamill's performance as the diminutive defender himself. In fact, if it wasn't for the next entry on our list, I feel like X2 Wolverine's Revenge would be widely considered the ultimate Wolverine video game experience. But soon enough, another title would come along which would blow this one out of the water, and we're going to talk about that game right now.
I'm the best there is at what I do. At least the people still living after I'm done doing it say that.
Here's another title that has long been a favourite of mine, and one that I've talked about countless times here on the channel. 2009's X-Men Origins Wolverine may not have been the first time that the old claw-handed knucklehead starred in his own game, but it sure as shit was the best. Developed by Raven Software, the studio behind the X-Men Legends and Marvel Ultimate Alliance series, X-Men Origins Wolverine is a hack-and-slash action-adventure game released alongside the film of the same name. I'm going to be talking specifically about the Uncaged edition for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. There were versions for the PS2 and Nintendo Wii, but frankly, the less said about those, the better. The game's story is loosely based on the film, but spends a lot more time exploring Logan's backstory as mutant military man turned science experiment gone wrong. Dismember and disembowel your way through African ruins, across the snow-covered Canadian Rockies, and in top-secret government testing facilities before your final face-off with not Deadpool. Origins Wolverine pulls so much from the comics to flesh out the film's shaky plot. In fact, the game improves on the movie in almost every conceivable way, from the writing to the balls-out M-rated action. Hugh Jackman lends his unmistakable Wolverine snarl to the game, and his portrayal of the character is easily as good here as it is in the movies. This has got to be one of the all-time best voice performances by a screen actor in video games. Norton, Hemsworth, take notes. This is how it's done. Add to that unlockable costumes such as Wolverine's classic yellow and blue, or 80s tan suits, and you could almost forget that this is a movie tie-in title at all. I mean, you still have to fight the merc with no mouth and laser eyes at the end, but otherwise every element feels like it was tailor-made for a video game. In terms of gameplay, it's your typical God of War / Devil May Cry style character action stuff. There are light and heavy attacks which can be chained together for devastating combos. You also have special moves that can be unlocked and upgraded by earning XP, plus environmental kills that really ramp up the blood and guts factor. Again, it's not breaking any new ground here, but everything is executed to such a high standard. Hammering away at the attack button and watching Wolverine spinning around the room in a frenzy of claws and severed limbs is so satisfying. And thanks to some solid animation and hit detection, you really feel every crushed cranium and punctured pancreas. Okay, the combat may get a little repetitive at times, but it's an old school hack and slash game, what do you expect? And besides, the enemy types you go up against are varied enough to keep things interesting. From the hulking leviathans to the teleporting shifters, every new foe you go up against requires you to learn their attack patterns and weaknesses, and the game never holds your hand in that regard. X-Men Origins Wolverine really puts you through the ringer at times, and it can be extremely rewarding when you finally beat a boss who has been sending you into a berserker rage. In addition to all of the slicing and dicing, there are plenty of environmental puzzles to solve, and even some light platforming, none of which is too taxing, but it's enough to keep an otherwise monotonous gameplay loop from ever outstaying its welcome. Put simply, X-Men Origins Wolverine is not only the best X-Men movie tie-in game, it's one of the best superhero games ever made. As a lifelong fan of the X-Men comics, movies, and of course animated series, getting to let loose as Wolverine in all his gory glory was a dream come true. This game is full of exciting set pieces and iconic comic book moments that stayed with me long after I finished the campaign, and have kept me going back for more. Whether it be fighting a 50-foot sentinel or simply watching as Logan's flesh heals over his adamantium skeleton in real time. This is the ultimate Wolverine experience in video games, no questions asked. Now, go play it, bub.
I bet you thought you were lucky.
So there you have it. Although the X-Men film franchise would soldier onwards for another 10 years after X-Men Origins Wolverine, there were no more movie tie-in games to accompany them. If you've seen the video in which I rank and review all of the MCU games, I went into a lot more detail about the demise of movie tie-in games, and needless to say, not even the X-Men were immune from extinction. In fact, due to the growing divide between Marvel film properties owned by Disney and those owned by Fox and Sony, X-Men games basically died out altogether. Which is a real shame, because as far as licensed games go, Marvel's Mutant team have had some of the best. Of the 4 games we've talked about today, 3 of them are surprisingly decent titles, and even X-Men the official game, by far the worst of the bunch, isn't totally without merit. After Raven Software set out the blueprint for how to make a truly great Mutant game, it would have been interesting to see where other developers might have taken the franchise. Instead, we got 2011's X-Men Destiny, and a 2D mobile game which tied into Days of Future Past. Actually, this one looks pretty rad. Can I still play this? Oh, no, of course not, because that's what happens to mobile games. They take your money and then they disappear forever, just like my ex-wife did. Oh well, now that the children of the Atom have moved out of the X-Mansion and into the House of Mouse, maybe we'll start seeing them pop up more frequently in games, cartoons, and all other assorted media. So, here's to a brighter tomorrow for the heroes who taught kids like me that it's okay to be a little odd. It's okay to be a square peg in a round hole. And it's okay to start a YouTube channel about comic book video games while all your friends are getting mortgages and having kids. Until next time, dear viewer, always remember, we're all a little different, but our differences do not rule us out. They only make us stronger. I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.